Hi, so let me introduce myself. I'm first and foremost an interpreter, and secondly a trainer. I started training 2 years after I graduated. And for me, training is a passion, I think, and I'm still training to this very day. And it was the training that led me to take an interest in various aspects of interpreting and to do some research. So I was very interested in working into B, for instance, the cooperation between recruiters and training institutions, and selection at intake and at exit of our programs. And I guess it's only natural because training isn't just a matter of transferring skills to a new generation of interpreters, but we also convey to them a whole set of beliefs and values, inevitably. So the research I'd like to talk to you today about was driven by training considerations initially. And it really started in 2020, so March 2020, COVID, the pandemic, when I was head of the interpreting section at AZIT, and we were put in lockdown, and overnight I had 40 students who had no access to the classroom, to the booths, to each other or their trainers. And we had to completely rethink the program and not just transfer it to online platforms, but really redesign it so that it could be given on online platforms. We didn't even have an online platform at the time, by the way. We started off with a gaming platform called Discord, which was not at all suitable. Beyond the technical obstacles, which I think by and large we overcame, I was also quite worried about the consequences for the students in terms of psychology and learning, of suddenly being isolated, having the classroom fragmented into a series of isolated spaces. And of course, not just the students, because when interpreting resumed, which it did after a few months, it was in what I call in the article full remote, in other words, working from home alone. So the conferences had also fragmented, splintered into as many isolated spaces as there were stakeholders. And this led me to think about in what way this fragmented meeting room of the COVID era differed from a standard meeting, in most cases in simultaneous interpreting. There had been many studies dating way back to the 1970s, but increasingly as of the year 2000, looking into the effects of remote simultaneous interpreting. I'll say RSI from now on, easier for me. But this RSI is a very gentle form of remoteness compared to the full remote during lockdown. In other words, the interpreters were, in nearly all cases, still grouped together in the same space. And they were often quite close to the meeting rooms, so just in an adjacent space. And in fact, this is what I call proximity remote interpreting. The focus of those studies was on health aspects, the well-being of interpreters, often with self-reported findings, some objective measurements. And as one might expect, the self-reporting indicated a sense of greater stress, fatigue setting in faster, and auditory strain. And the studies also considered quality, but the findings from the various studies are not very clear-cut. And I think in interpreting, quality is a very slippery notion anyway. And it's quite hard to design a study that will have a control group with sufficient numbers in remote and on-site. But in any event, those findings, such as they were, are of course interesting, but they weren't really relevant to the new situation we had in the COVID era. Because the configuration had changed. The interpreters were not only distanced from the event, there wasn't really an event as such. The event had been split up, and they were distanced, perhaps this is the most serious consequence from each other. And it was that consideration, this is what the students, trainers and colleagues were complaining about most, over and beyond all the other problems. And this led me to think about ordinary simultaneous, in other words, on-site simultaneous, and the impact that it had had on the profession. When simultaneous became the most usual form gradually over the years of interpreting, there was a lot of pushback from consecutive interpreters, as one would expect, because it completely disrupted their world. And the expressions used were actually echo the expressions being used today as well, of a sense of demotion, of displacement and dehumanization. And there's still, even with more recent authors, a vague nostalgia for the pre-simultaneous era. For instance, Dam and Gentili, in a fairly recent article, say, and I think this reflects the feeling of many interpreters, that the second and third generations of interpreters, we're talking about post-Nuremberg here, did not share the glory of that first generation. So, and Baigori Halon emphasizes the sense of physical distancing and the technical mediation introduced in simultaneous with the equipment. But arguably, I would say that simultaneous has contributed hugely to the emergence of a profession of conference interpreting. It enabled a large increase in the number of languages that could be offered at any given meeting, and hence a considerable increase in the number of interpreters working for a given event. The interpreters worked together, and this gave rise to the term team, which has become so commonplace amongst interpreters that we don't even stop to reflect on what that says about the perception we have of our profession. And when you read articles by interpreters or listen to discussions or look on the AIC website, actually this term team is central to our self-understanding. Also, with the introduction of simultaneous, the complexity of the process became obvious to the observer and to interpreters and recruiters, and led to an offering and an uptake of formal training opportunities. And despite the displacement from the centre of the event, simultaneous does give interpreting a new kind of visibility. On television, broadcasts, leaders with headsets on, sort of listening with concentration to interpreting, are actually a trope of high-level events that people observe all the time. Above all, I would say that simultaneous introduces a separate space distinctive for interpreters, which has been described as relegation or demotion or displacement, but actually is also a space that can be creative and defining. It marks out interpreting as a separate activity and creates areas for this teamwork, which is so essential to our perception of ourselves. And teamwork can take on various forms. Very often the lists of how we work as a team focus very much on the practical, so jotting down figures, names, indicating a word in a glossary, or finding a document. But in the article, and through my research for this article, it became gradually obvious to me that the teamwork extends much beyond that purely pragmatic assistance. There's a lot of discussion about the content of the meeting, the background, the participants in the meeting. So a lot of knowledge is circulated amongst the interpreters. There's another function that's interesting, and that is that there are many observations, kind of rapid debriefs after interpreting somebody or after an interpreting turn, which help to relieve the tension that arises inevitably from the discrepancy between the very rigid norm we have about faithfulness. So we have to be accurate we have to say everything the speaker says. We have to convey all of the meaning or the intent. So that's the norm. And the reality of a conference, when you have to struggle with extremely fast speakers or all kinds of content, that tension is often released or relieved through comments about how difficult a speaker is, and a responding comment from a teammate expressing sympathy or empathy, which helps to save face and helps to relieve that tension. And of course, there's a great deal of socializing in the booth, in the adjacent areas, and when on mission, during evenings, lunches, coffee breaks, and the like. I would like to pick out something said by Taylor Bouladon in her book in 2007, where she has a tremendous sense of this, the importance of this socializing. And she says that very often on mission there's a marvellous sense of comradeship, and the interpreters become like family for each other for the duration of the mission. The fact that an interpreter can write that and can get a lot of recognition and acknowledgement from other interpreters, I think says a lot about the profession. And of course, when interpreting in simultaneous on site, interpreters listen to each other working, and this is a kind of continuation of the training they receive, in that there's transmission of interpreting practice and learning from each other. So these functions, I think, are extremely significant given the performance-related nature of interpreting. It's a live performance in which the interpreters have very little control over the input, and the immediacy of interpreting. Interpreters occupy a very special position on the margins, but also in the thick of things. Well, this brings me to full remote, where this special space is lost. The interpreters are no longer in a shared space. They are scattered, and it's actually quite difficult to recreate that shared space, although some platforms have done, but to a limited extent, obviously, in that you can share a virtual booth. So hence my study. I wanted to look at inter-interpreter exchanges in on-site meetings and in fully remote meetings. I took 7 meetings. There are 2 pairs of meetings, so it's the same meeting 2 consecutive years, the same body, the same subject matter to a large extent. And one of them is in remote, and one because of COVID in one case, and then the next one is on site. And in the other case, the first one was on site, and the second one was in remote because of technical difficulties with setting up the booths. And the 3 other meetings are fully remote. What I did was note, with permission from the interpreters, the length, the nature, and the content of the exchanges. In the case of remote, most of that was done on WhatsApp, but there was a prior phone call in 2 cases, and an exchange of a glossary in an email exchange. So the findings are that there, and this is perhaps not surprising, that there are very significant differences between the 2 configurations. In remote, the emphasis, as one would expect, was very much on practical matters, so turn-taking, handover. There was some commentary on the meeting, the difficulties, the speakers, but it was much thinner than in on-site and fairly limited. There were also 1 or 2 signs of validation and empathy being expressed. The comment on meeting content was almost entirely absent, except in a prior phone call in 2 cases. But most significantly, I think, there was no conversation about the world of interpreting, about the world beyond that event. And in practice, it was hard to listen to the colleagues, and the listening to colleagues was done only very sporadically and not in a consistent way. On site, the exchanges were much richer and more varied. There were numerous debriefs, so a colleague would finish the half-hour turn, come out of the booth and talk to another colleague about how difficult or how interesting or how pleasant it had been to interpret that half hour, and would receive feedback and acknowledgement. Focus on interpreting matters throughout. Although the interpreters knew each other, the socialising, which was warm and friendly, focused very much on interpreting matters. There was a lot of sharing of background information about the meeting and discussion of meeting content, and above all, and this is the main difference I would say, numerous exchanges about the world of interpreting in the broad sense. So language markets, secretariats, this being in Paris, training and students enrolled, retirement issues, conversations about the quality of colleagues, a lot of information about the world of interpreting. So this observation shows how on-site interpreting really provides a forum for interpreters to have conversations that deepen their understanding of content, yes, but further their knowledge of the profession and forge and refine shared beliefs and norms. And I would say that the booth and the adjacent areas, everything around the event, which is shared physically, creates a space of exclusive socialization because it's reserved for the interpreters. It's most unusual for a non-interpreter to penetrate that space. And in a way, interpreters in their debriefs, their exchanges, cultivate their own analysis of the event in a kind of meta-discourse of interpreters about the meeting. Now, my concern at the time when writing the article, so I wrote most of it in 2022, it was published in 2023, was that if full remote were to prevail, and at the time that couldn't be ruled out, this would undermine professional cohesion and even a sense of belonging to the profession. As it happens, full remote, it has not prevailed completely. It's one of many interpreting options. But also, interpreters have found ways of offsetting to some extent the negative impact of full remote. In fact, there were already signs that this was happening in the survey because I mentioned the prior phone calls, the exchange of glossary, and some meta-discourse and signifying of empathy. Indeed, interestingly, the empathy was also expressed when the technicians were included in the WhatsApp with the technicians who were, which is actually a fairly positive trend, I think. Also, the same technology that makes full remote possible also provides opportunity for more inter-interpreter exchange in the form of webinars, conferences, formal and informal online exchanges. And I think what we've seen is that associations such as IEC and consortia such as the EMCI provide a good platform for these exchanges which can offset increasing remoteness of interpreting. But for me, the most interesting takeaway from the whole reflection process and the survey was just how rich the exchange generated by on-site simultaneous interpreting is. And I think that it's this that leads to the particularly high degree of professional cohesion and identification with the profession that one observes amongst conference interpreters. So thank you.